The road leading to the Canadian border crossing was quiet that morning, the kind of calm that usually makes travelers feel relaxed. A line of cars slowly rolled forward toward the checkpoint, each driver inching closer to the small booth where a uniformed border officer waited. For most people, it was routine. Hand over your passport, answer a few questions, and continue on your way. But for the group sitting in a silver SUV near the back of the line, the moment they were about to face would turn into something they never expected. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, please subscribe, like my video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. Inside the SUV were three Americans on what they thought would be a simple day trip. They had been driving for hours from the northern United States, joking about finally visiting Canada for the first time together. One of them leaned back in his seat and said confidently that crossing the border would probably take less than 5 minutes. Another laughed and said he'd heard Canada was basically the same as the US anyway. None of them seemed worried. In fact, they looked completely relaxed. But what they didn't realize was that in just a few minutes, their confidence would completely collapse. As the line moved forward, they watched other cars pull up to the booth. Drivers handed something to the officer through the window. The officer glanced down, asked a quick question or two, and waved them through. It all looked simple. The driver of the SUV tapped the steering wheel and said, "See, easy." His friend in the passenger seat nodded. What they didn't notice was the one thing every driver before them had handed over: a passport. The SUV slowly rolled forward until it finally stopped at the checkpoint. The border officer stepped forward calmly, his expression neutral and professional. He leaned slightly toward the driver's window. "Good morning," he said. "Citizenship?" "American," the driver replied casually. "Where are you headed today?" "Just visiting Canada for the day. Thought we'd check it out." The officer nodded slightly. "Passports, please." There was a brief pause inside the SUV. The passenger looked back at him. Then the driver laughed lightly, like the officer had just made a joke. "Oh, we don't have passports," he said. "We're just visiting for the day." The officer didn't laugh. His expression didn't change at all. Instead, he simply repeated the request. "Passports, please." The driver shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Yeah, we actually didn't bring them. We figured since we're Americans it wouldn't be a big deal." For a moment, the officer just looked at him. The casual tone inside the SUV slowly started to disappear. The officer straightened up slightly and spoke in a calm but firm voice. "You need a valid passport or approved travel document to enter Canada." The three friends stared at him. One of them leaned forward from the back seat and said, "Wait, seriously?" The officer nodded. "Yes." There was silence in the car. The driver blinked, clearly confused. "But we're from the US, we're just crossing over for a few hours." The officer's response was simple. "You still need a passport." The confidence that had filled the SUV just minutes earlier suddenly started to vanish. The passenger in the front seat rubbed his forehead. "Hold on," he said. "Are you saying we can't go into Canada at all?" "That's correct." The driver looked genuinely shocked now. "We drove 4 hours to get here." The officer remained calm. "Do you have passports in the vehicle?" "No." "Enhanced driver's licenses?" Another pause. "No." The officer nodded slowly, as if he had heard this many times before. "Then you cannot enter Canada today." Inside the SUV, the disbelief was growing. One of the friends muttered something under his breath. Another pulled out his phone and started searching something online. "Wait," the passenger suddenly said, looking up at the officer. "Google says Americans can visit Canada." The officer nodded again. "That's correct. With the proper travel documents." The driver leaned back in his seat, clearly frustrated. "Man, nobody told us we needed a passport." The officer didn't respond to the complaint. Instead, he calmly pointed toward a lane to the side. "I'm going to ask you to pull over into the secondary inspection area." That sentence instantly made the situation feel more serious. The driver's eyes widened slightly. "Secondary inspection? Why?" "Because you attempted to enter Canada without the required documentation." The driver hesitated, but slowly nodded. Okay. He pulled the SUV into the area the officer indicated. The relaxed road trip mood was gone now, completely gone. As they parked, another officer approached the vehicle. This one looked slightly older, with the calm confidence of someone who had handled thousands of similar situations. "Morning," he said. "Step out of the vehicle, please." The three friends exchanged glances before slowly opening their doors. Now the reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. The officer asked for their identification, which they handed over nervously. "So," the officer said, glancing at their driver's licenses, "you were trying to enter Canada without passports?" The driver shrugged awkwardly. We didn't know we needed them. The officer looked up. Passports have been required for years. The man in the back seat spoke up quickly. Yeah, but we thought that was just for flights. The officer shook his head. No, land border crossings require them too. One of the friends sighed loudly. This is unbelievable. But what happened next made the situation even worse. While checking their information, the officer began asking more questions. Where are you planning to go in Canada? We were just going to explore for the day. Where specifically? We didn't really plan that far. How long were you planning to stay? Maybe a few hours. The officer studied their answers carefully. Then he asked something that made them even more nervous. Did you research the entry requirements before coming here? There was a long pause. Finally, the driver said quietly, not really. And then he explained something that many travelers don't realize. Border crossings aren't just casual checkpoints. They are controlled international entry points with strict legal requirements. Without proper identification, officers cannot allow someone to enter the country, no matter where they're from. The group listened silently as the officer explained. For the first time since arriving, the situation felt very real. The driver ran his hand through his hair. So, what happens now? You will be turned around and directed back to the United States. The passenger frowned. That's it? For today, yes. The driver let out a frustrated laugh. We drove all the way here for nothing. The officer didn't react emotionally. Instead, he simply said something that stuck with them. International travel requires preparation. The three friends slowly walked back toward their SUV. Their earlier confidence had completely disappeared. As they got back inside the vehicle, one of them shook his head in disbelief. I can't believe we didn't know that. The driver sighed and started the engine. Next time, we're bringing passports. And as the SUV was guided back toward the U.S. side of the border, the lesson became painfully clear. Crossing into another country isn't just a short drive away. Even between neighboring countries, the rules still matter, and ignoring them can turn what was supposed to be a simple trip into a long, embarrassing journey back home. But what surprised the group the most wasn't just being turned away. It was realizing how common this situation actually is. Every year, border officers encounter travelers who assume the rules don't apply to them. People who believe crossing into another country is as simple as crossing a state line, until the moment they reach the checkpoint, and suddenly realize it isn't. Just when the three friends thought the story was over and the embarrassment couldn't get any worse, something else happened that made the entire situation even more uncomfortable. As their SUV slowly rolled back toward the U.S. side of the border, the reality of what had just happened finally settled in. The driver kept both hands tight on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, while the other two sat in silence. The confident jokes they had been making earlier were completely gone. Then the passenger suddenly broke the silence. Hold on, does this mean we're in trouble now? The driver shrugged nervously. I don't know. In the backseat, the third friend was already scrolling through his phone again, this time reading travel forums and government websites. Guys, it literally says right here you need a passport to enter Canada by land. The driver let out a long sigh. Well, that would have been useful information 4 hours ago. But just as they approached the U.S. checkpoint again, another thought hit them. Wait, the passenger said, suddenly sitting up straight. What if the U.S. border asks where we went? The driver blinked. We're about to tell them we tried to leave the country without a passport. For a moment, the three of them looked at each other and started laughing nervously. Not because it was funny, but because the situation had become so ridiculous. When they finally pulled up to the American border officer, the officer leaned down toward the window. Where are you coming from today? The driver hesitated for half a second before answering. The